Birutė Galdikas spent her life observing and living with orangutans in the wild rainforests of Borneo, and almost everything we now know about the primates is because of her. Stretching over half a century, it was the longest study by one scientist of any wild mammal in the world. But if Galdikas arrived in the jungle a curious primatologist, she would become a surrogate mother to a species threatened by extinction from illegal loggers and the exotic pet trade. The camp she set up in the jungle became a halfway house through which orphaned orangutans could be released back into the wild. It was a little like running a school for naughty children. She often awoke to find not one, not two, but 4 small orangutans in bed with her. They ate her toothpaste, shampoo, and binoculars. They dumped bowls of salt into her tea, and she often found old socks floating in her morning coffee. Yet Galdikas knew that this was more than horseplay. She believed that looking into the eyes of an orangutan was a window into the human soul. We see something ancient, she said, something timeless, something that reflects who we once were.
Welcome to Last Rites. This week we're looking at Birutė Galdikas, the world-leading expert on orangutans who died in March, aged 79. Georgia, you chose Birutė Galdikas as our subject this week. Why did you want to explore her life?
So I said in the intro that Birutė believed that looking into an orangutan's eyes was like a window into another world. And in many ways, Birutė's life is the same. She spent more than half a century living in the Tanjung Puting National Park, which is nestled right in the heart of Indonesian Borneo, where about 90% of orangutans live. And this was a time when almost nothing was known about orangutans. The terrain was incredibly new. And it was also a time when it was very rare for women to be living in the jungle. It was rare for women to be pioneering scientists. And it was rare for them to be observing primates, in the wild, in the flesh, on the ground, as opposed to in a lab. So she was a pioneer in so many aspects, and her work was seen by so many people as incredibly important. But what really struck me about this story is that it's really a tale about how much impact one individual can have. She dedicated her life to understanding and saving orangutans, and we are the richer for it. And in some ways, she made a huge impact on everything we understand and know about primates. But on the other hand, her entire life's work was beset by corrupt politics, by bureaucracy, by climate change, illegal loggers, the exotic pet trade. And by the end of her life, she could say that she had put orangutans on the map for the first time, but she couldn't say that she had saved them from near extinction. And so there's a sadness to this story, which I found very interesting and quite touching.
Where do you think it's best to start with Birutė Galdikas?
So we really have to go back to the man who first sent her to the Borneo rainforests, a well-known Kenyan-British paleoanthropologist and archaeologist called Dr. Louis Leakey, who some of our listeners will have heard of. He was a giant in science in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And when she met Leakey, this was the late 60s, she was studying for a master's in anthropology at UCLA in America. She'd grown up in Canada, but she'd moved to America recently. And she recalled that one day he came in to give a visiting lecture. She described him as a kind of silver-tongued preacher man. He was filled with anecdotes and tales of people, mostly women, he had sent off to Africa to study the great apes. And one was called Dian, Fossey, and we'll get on to her in a minute. But he sort of stood up in front of all of the students and said, I've just received a telegram from Fossey that a mountain gorilla has just tied up her shoelaces for the first time. This is changing our understanding of where we as humans come from. Now, she had always been fascinated in unlocking the idea of what she called the secrets of the universe, so understanding where we as humans came from. And she'd always wanted to study orangutans in the wild. And so she sort of went up to Leakey at the end and said, I want to go to Borneo to study orangutans, please send me there. And it took about 3 years, but by 1971, she had finally got to Borneo.
It's worth just pausing on Leakey as a figure, because you mentioned that Galdikas is interested in unlocking the sort of origins of mankind. And this was really what Leakey was known for. So Lewis and his wife, Mary, were, as you said, famous paleoanthropologists who, in the 1950s and early 1960s, transformed our understanding of where humans originated. They were best known for a series of major fossil discoveries in East Africa, particularly at this place called the Olduvai Gorge in what is now Tanzania. Their most famous discovery happened in 1959 when Mary Leakey was out walking her dogs. Louis Leakey was ill that day, so stayed at home. And she came across this skull that was poking out of the dirt. And this became known as the Nutcracker Man because he had these kind of very large jaws and teeth. And essentially the discovery of that skull was really part of this effort of Lewis and Mary Leakey to show us how humans originated in Africa. So it really revolutionized the study of human origins. But Louis Leakey wasn't just interested in bones and fossils. He was also trying to understand early human behavior. And he thought that the best way to study this was to do research into our ancestors, so the great apes. Now, the way he decided that he wanted to study these animals was quite unusual because until now, most of the studies, such as they were, had been conducted in quite controlled environments, so in lab environments, etc. But he thought that the best way to study these creatures was by sending someone to live and really sort of absorb themselves into their lives. And Leakey's sort of great insight was that he thought that women could do this better than men. So he's very famous for sending 3 women out to study the apes. The first, which most of our listeners will probably have heard of, is Jane Goodall, who was sent to Tanzania in the late 1950s, early 1960s to study chimpanzees. The second, who listeners probably would have heard of as well because of a very famous film called Gorillas in the Mist, starring Sigourney Weaver, is Dian Fossey, who was sent to Rwanda to study gorillas and was killed in still disputed circumstances in 1985 in her cabin. And Galdikas was the third of these women, probably the least famous.
Yeah, she actually once said that she believed that was either because she was stuck in Borneo studying an incredibly solitary animal, but also because she had a surname no one could pronounce.
Right, yeah, exactly. And we'll come on to why she had that surname a bit later. So you have these 3 women who have been sent by Dr. Louis Leakey to study these apes. And these women become known as Leakey's angels.
And I think we should pause here and look at why he was sending women. At that time, there were far more male scientists than female scientists. He believed that women were more patient and observant and nurturing. So he thought they would be better suited in the wilds of the jungle to, patiently observe these apes. And he also believed that if they were to come face to face with a male primate, they would be less threatening than a man.
Yeah, this is a really interesting feature of this story because when we originally started researching for this, I just assumed, well, this is the 1960s and 70s. Second wave feminism is building in America and around the world. And so obviously there's going to be more women entering, these kind of jobs and these kind of research situations. But actually, when you hear Leakey's justification for why he was sending women, it actually sort of in many ways reinforces sort of traditional gender stereotypes.
I mean, yes. So some feminists believe that he was reinforcing, as you say, this kind of very essentialist view of gender. So women are nurturing sort of mother figures almost. And in some ways that was regressive. But, on the other hand, this was redefining what women could do in hospitable environments. So it was seen as somewhat scandalous to kind of drop women into a jungle situation where they would be often alone, face to face with potentially aggressive animals, or so people thought. And we can't forget that science was also a bit of an old boys club, right? Most scientists were men. Women were relegated to sort of feminine sciences such as botany. There was something radical in the way that they were sent by Leakey, and in a way they became sort of icons for a generation of female scientists, particularly when National Geographic put them on their front cover, which they did for all three women and for Galdikas in 1975. But on the other hand, as you say, this assumes that women are empathetic, nurturing, gentle creatures, which many feminists in the late 60s, early 70s rightly challenged.
Okay, so Birutė Galdikas is studying for a master's at UCLA in the late 1960s. And she has gone up to Leakey at the end of one of his very charismatic lectures and said, "Can you send me to Borneo so I can study orangutans like you sent Dian Fossey and like you sent Jane Goodall?" Before we get on to her research, I wonder if you could just give us a sense of when she became interested in orangutans, why she became interested in orangutans in particular.
Yeah, so nothing in her upbringing really suggested that she would end up studying orangutans over half a century in Borneo. So she was born in 1946 in Germany as her parents were fleeing the Soviet occupation in Lithuania, where she was originally from. And they eventually ended up in Canada, where her dad worked as a house painter and her mother was a nurse, so neither were particularly science oriented. And there are a few things that kind of triggered her love of adventure and of primates. So firstly, she picked up a copy of Curious George. And she sort of saw this monkey and an adventurer with a hat on, and she said, "I want to be an adventurer." So that's one anecdote. But I think the more...
Do you think that's true? I sometimes think this with people when they're retrospectively telling the story. I mean, that seems too obvious that she would have read Curious George and that would be why she became interested in apes.
You know what? I think people in hindsight, when people dedicate their life to one very niche thing, people are asked in hindsight what inspired them, and then they possibly pluck out a memory from many and think that's the moment.
Yeah.
Of course, there are layers, but I quite like that anecdote because I myself quite enjoyed Curious George, although I did not want to become an adventurer. So I think the more telling anecdote really is that she describes sitting outside in her garden on a sort of starry night. There's no light pollution. And she describes sort of looking up at the stars and thinking, where did we come from as humans? And she always has this phrase in interviews that she wanted to unlock the secrets of the universe. So the idea of, where did we come from? And for her, primates, as for Leakey, primates kind of contained a glimmer of truth in that because they are our ancestors. And she really first became interested in primates when she saw a photograph of an orangutan in a magazine. And if anyone's seen a picture of an orangutan, they have these great dark orbs of eyes, which are kind of flecked with white. And they're incredibly human. You can kind of gaze into it and look like you're looking into the eyes of a human. And it was this that transfixed her attention and her interest because she thought, firstly, these animals about which almost nothing is known. I mean, nothing was known about orangutans. People sort of thought, oh, they kind of leap around the canopy of Borneo and that's about it. So nothing was known about them. So she wanted to sort of unlock that for other people. But also she wanted to understand where it was we as humans came from. She wanted to understand why it was that when you look into the eyes of an orangutan, you're seeing a window into the human soul. So she arrived in Borneo in 1971 with her first husband, a man named Rod Brindamore. And of course, we've mentioned that nothing was known about orangutans. They were mostly kept as pets or sold as pets, and scientists didn't really know anything about them. The forest itself was incredibly wild. To get there, they had to take a 12-hour journey in a boat up the river with a couple of Indonesian officials and a local cook. So they arrive in the forest and they find this old, decrepit hut, which had been abandoned by illegal loggers. And it's incredibly flimsy. The walls are made of bark and it's definitely not orangutan proof. So orangutans are very quickly clambering all over the roof and kind of puncturing holes and water is seeping through. So it's not ideal.
And it's not also not inappropriate that the camp is called Camp Leakey, obviously after Louis Leakey.
Indeed, Sam, a brilliant boy for me. So she calls the camp Leakey after the man who sent her there.
Okay, so her and Rod Brindamore, her husband, have set up camp in this rather flimsy structure. And now the task becomes actually finding orangutans and observing them. And this is actually really difficult, right? I mean, can you explain a little bit about why it is so hard for her to find orangutans?
Yeah, so there are two layers to this. So number one, orangutans are incredibly solitary creatures. You know, Jane Goodall said that Birutė's job was far harder than hers because orangutans are far more scarce than chimpanzees. And it would take Birutė weeks to track a single orangutan. The second point is that this was very inhospitable terrain. So Borneo is made up of these swollen rivers and swamps and dense jungles. It's incredibly humid. She would spend hours kind of trekking armpit deep in black swamp. She got malaria, she got dengue fever. Insect bites would lead to swollen hands, which meant that she couldn't move. She grew very thin because she didn't want to carry the extra weight of food on her back. So she would persist on mainly just sardines and black coffee. She also came head to head with many male orangutans who almost charged her. You know, these are very big, people thought aggressive animals. She often had a local Indonesian guide with her, but she was largely on her own. And this required, as Leakey predicted, huge powers of observation and patience. And there's a very moving bit in the 1975 National Geographic cover story, which really puts her on the map and orangutans on the map, where she describes the process of carefully treading through the forest and listening attentively to the snap of a twig or the brush of the canopy above her head, which would give the signal that there is an orangutan.
It's so atmospheric when you listen to her describing those early encounters that she has with the orangutans. And I think it's partly because, you know, they are the only one of the apes who moves through trees. You know, they're arboreal, right? And so they move incredibly gracefully through these trees. And she always says that provided they're not actually running away from you, they actually move relatively slowly. So, as you say, it's this very patient, attentive process that she's engaged in when she's trying to track them down. And there's something about it that just sounds incredibly atmospheric.
Yeah, and actually it's worth it. I mean, you said that the orangutan is the only one that moves through the trees. It's worth pointing out the differences in what she discovers and Goodall discovers and Fossey discovers. Because Goodall famously finds that chimpanzees use tools like humans. So she discovered the chimpanzee kind of fishing for termites. And this was an incredibly important discovery for Leakey and for her. Fossey discovers that gorillas are highly empathetic, social creatures who grieve for their loved ones like humans, right? And Galdikas actually discovers that of the three apes, the orangutan, which in Malay means person of the forest, is actually the most genetically distant from humans. We, of course, knew that they were solitary creatures, but she discovers that the bond between a mother and its infant is one of the most intense of any mammal. She discovered an incredibly long birth interval for orangutans, the longest of any mammal. It's about 8 years, which actually makes orangutans even more susceptible to extinction. She discovers over 400 species of plant which is consumed by orangutans. And she finds that they have this very sophisticated spatial memory to support this diet of fruits, which they would scatter across the forest, acting like kind of gardeners of the forest. And, you know, she was the first person to see a wild orangutan sleeping on the ground, the first person to observe combat between two wild orangutans. So everything she is discovering, which she then writes about eventually in her PhD and in the National Geographic piece, which kind of puts her on the map and on the orangutans on the map. Everything is new. People are understanding orangutans and their behavior for the first time.
But she's not just observing these orangutans in the wild, is she? She's also beginning to adopt orangutans that have been illegally sold as pets or have been in captivity. Do you want to explain a little bit about that?
So, I mean, she arrives to do scientific research, but she finds the forest completely under siege from illegal loggers, and orangutans are sold as pets in the exotic pet trade. And very quickly, the Indonesian Forestry Service begins confiscating captives and bringing them to Camp Leakey for Galdikas to rehabilitate. So she sort of teaches them the ways of the forest, how to get fruit for themselves and build a nest in the canopy. And in time, she releases them back into the world.
Yeah, and because of how orangutans have this very long period of connection between the mother and the child, this leads to some quite unusual situations where these small baby orangutans will literally be clinging to her, right? And they will think that she is their mother. And of course, this period, as you say, goes on for sort of 7 or 8 years. So that leads to some difficulties, right, as well?
Yeah, so the first orangutan that they adopt is someone called Sigito. The orangutan is called Sigito. And they find Sigito in a wooden crate smelling of urine and feces in an Indonesian man's home. And Sigito clings to Galdikas as if she is his mother, because as you say, the incredibly close bond between an orangutan and his or her mother is a foundational part of the way that they learn how to be in the world. So Sigito kind of clings to her and howls if she leaves him. If she bathes in the river, he sort of follows her and clings to her. And there's these lovely pictures of her sort of swaddled with lots of baby orangutans. And she described their relationship as kind of endearing but claustrophobic. You know, he wets the bed. So it's worth pointing out that Rod Brindamore, her husband, every time he sort of tries to pick up Sigito kind of bites him or defecates on him.
Well, and also, I mean, poor Rod Brindamore, they are all sleeping in the same bed often.
They're always sleeping in the same bed. So in the National Geographic piece of 1975, one of my absolute favorite anecdotes is that she lives in this hut and she often awakes in the morning to find kind of 5 orangutans curled up next to her. They eat everything in the hut. Nothing is immune from orangutans. They steal her mosquito nets and bedding and they kind of scamper up to the canopy to use it for themselves. They kind of drink her tea and they kind of spit milk at her. And it's just this kind of chaotic crash of unruly school children. And she actually once said that she grew to believe that they were just using their sort of high ape intelligence just to make her go crazy.
Well, this is something that I didn't really realize about orangutans. I mean, like, they love like pranks. It seems like they are like a very
they're monkey. I mean, you know, it's a kind of they're primates.
Right. I mean, you know, there's stories of these orangutans around Camp Leakey actually stealing canoes and paddling them down river and sort of depositing the canoe somewhere like random. And as you said, I love all these stories of these orangutans who seem to be having so much fun interacting with humans.
They're always kind of pulling off her hat. So there's a 30-minute YouTube documentary which is well worth listeners watching. And there's this moment when she's in the boat with the documentary film crew. And she sort of says, "Oh, can we actually just stop on this random riverbank?" And they're like, "Why?" And she's like, "Well, I told X, let's call him Sigito. I told Sigito that I would be there to give him mangoes." And they're like, "Okay." And she sees this orangutan kind of swinging down the canopy, waiting patiently for her on this riverbank, this particular riverbank that she apparently said to this orangutan she would be there at a certain time. And you see her kind of clambering up and sitting calmly next to him and giving him mangoes. And there's other reports of orangutans kind of knocking on her door and her coming out and sitting in companionable silence alongside them. So she calls them amongst her best friends. She becomes incredibly close to them.
Right. And actually, this is something that in an article that's published about Galdikas in the late 1990s by this journalist called Linda Spalding, which we'll come on to later, which was this quite critical article of Galdikas, and we'll talk about why that was the case. But in this article, she claims that the presence of Sigito, who you've already mentioned, put a real strain on her relationship with Rod Brindamore. So what this article says is that the infant, so that's the orangutan, slept between Galdikas and her husband, frequently wetting the bed at night. If Brindamore so much as moved in Galdikas's direction, Sugito squealed in jealousy and bit him. So, I mean, anyone who's ever been around a dog, when you try to be intimate with your partner in the presence of a particularly jealous dog, can imagine the sort of this scenario.
Yeah, and actually that raises an ethical point because dogs have been domesticated for, centuries, years. And orangutans are wild animals. And the great criticism of Galdikas, particularly from the 90s onwards, is that the very close proximity between her and the orangutans is both scientifically unethical in terms of scientific objectivity, and it's also potentially leading to the cross-contamination of diseases. And this ethical complication will become important for Galdikas's story when modern conservationists from the 1990s onwards begin questioning her rehabilitation methods.
We've been dancing around this a little bit, but I think it's worth zooming out and having a look at the political context in Indonesia when Galdikas is working. So she arrives in the early 1970s after what is one of the bloodiest transitions of government in the entire Cold War in Indonesia. In the middle of the 1960s, a man named General Suharto takes power from a man who is rather confusingly called President Sukarno. And this is essentially a military coup against the rising level of communist influence within the Indonesian government. And so General Suharto takes power, and then there is this massive wave of repression, hundreds of thousands of people killed, one of the largest mass killings of the 20th century. And if anyone is interested in this, there's a fantastic book by Vincent Bevans called The Jakarta Method, which looks into this in more detail. But out of that violence emerges Suharto's New Order regime. That's what it's called, the sort of New Order. And this is an authoritarian, militarized, deeply anti-communist regime. Now, this is important context for Galdikas because if President Sukarno, so the previous president, was still in power, Sukarno had increasingly embraced a kind of anti-Western philosophy, increasingly aligning himself with the communist world. And when Suharto comes to power, what happens is, yes, there is this incredibly bloody transition, but Indonesia is also trying to transition and pivot back towards the West. So they're really keen to get Western scientific researchers into Indonesia. And this explains why Galdikas is able to get a research permit from the Indonesian government. I'm not suggesting that she's at all implicated in that completely horrific transition of the Suharto regime, but I do think that provides the context for why Indonesia were keen to attract Western scientists. Because the other thing that's important about this context is that her research is exactly the kind of apolitical research that's appealing to the Indonesian government. It looks really good for them if Galdikas is doing sort of world-breaking research into orangutans. But at the same time, her research is increasingly coming up against another goal of the Indonesian government, which is giving concessions for logging and for timber, etc. So development, which is increasingly going to clash with what Galdikas is doing in the rainforest.
Okay, and in terms of the post-colonial context, I think we should talk a bit about that because Rwanda, Tanzania, and Borneo are all post-colonial states, right? And so I think there's a sense in which they have to navigate the complexity of newly independent countries and working as Westerners within that.
Exactly. I mean, this is something that all three, so Dian Fossey, Birutė Galdikas, and Jane Goodall, have to navigate. is the fact that they are working in either colonial countries or very recently independent countries. And Galdikas actually navigates this quite well. I think of the three, navigates it the best. She divorces Rod Brindamore in the 1970s and marries a man named Pak Bohat, who is a local indigenous Indonesian, a Dayak man who was one of her research assistants originally. And so Galdikas very much embeds herself within Indonesian society. She hires Indonesian research assistants to, help her with her work, and she mentors lots of Indonesian students during their studies. This is quite different to like someone like Dian Fossey, who arguably had an incredibly antagonistic relationship to the local population in Rwanda, who she saw as essentially a threat.
An obstacle to her work.
An obstacle to her work, a threat to the guerrillas, and frankly, she expressed racist views about the local inhabitants. She called them racial slurs. In her conflict with the poachers, she engaged in quite horrific tactics involving torture, intimidation, and it's difficult when you pair that with the fact that she is talking about the local people using these racial epithets. It's difficult to separate those tactics from her racism as well.
Yeah, and I mean, this raises an interesting debate about kind of Western scientific influence on kind of indigenous cultures. And I think, as you said, Galdikas kind of navigated that the best, because not only did she open the world's eyes to the orangutans and did incredible research, but she also worked with the Indonesian government and with local Indonesians to get this work done. Though, of course, this becomes harder as political shifts in Indonesia change the ease with which she can do her conservation work.
Yeah, so during the 1980s, her relationship with the Indonesian government is relatively positive. In 1982, she lobbies to turn Tanjung Puting from a wildlife reserve into a national park. And what that essentially means is it has greater protections. She also works as a senior advisor on orangutan issues for Indonesia's Ministry of Forestry.
Yeah, and sorry, just to cut in, the most famous case is called the Bangkok 6, when 6 infant orangutans are seized en route to the former Yugoslavia in 1990. And the Indonesian government kind of call up her as an orangutan expert and say, can you come and negotiate their return and rehabilitate them? And this becomes like a world famous story and a kind of symbol of the cruelty of the exotic pet trade, which is one of the biggest threats to, and still is one of the biggest threats to the orangutan population. And they kind of traveled home with her to Camp Leakey. It's also worth pointing out that the Chinese trade for dragonfish, incredibly lucrative trade, is by the 1990s also blossoming, and it floods the area with poachers. And she would kind of go out at night in a rubber dinghy, which was called the Zodiac. And she describes kind of apprehending them and taking them to the local police. So in some ways, she's using similar underhand tactics to Fossey, although her activism was far less problematic.
Yeah, and I think by the 1990s, Galdikas is beginning to face increasing criticism, I think really from two angles. So on the one hand, her relationship with the Indonesian government is beginning to sour. And this is largely because of this problem of deforestation and logging, right? So she is increasingly sticking her neck out and saying, if you destroy this environment, then you're also going to destroy these orangutans. You know, we mentioned at the start of the political context bit that, you know, the Indonesian government is trying to do two things at once. They're trying to foster internationally renowned research on orangutans, but they're also trying to profit from logging operations. And what you see in the 1990s is those two things begin to contradict with each other because those logging operations begin to very directly encroach upon the bits of the forest where orangutans are living. So that relationship begins to sour. The other source of criticism is coming from primatologists, so her fellow primatologists, who by the 1990s, many of whom are criticizing her methods of rehabilitating these orangutans. I mentioned earlier, there's this article that's published in 1997 by Linda Spalding, where she travels to Camp Leakey in order to sort of have a look of what's going on. And she interviews lots of people who describe the orangutans actually being looked after rather poorly at Camp Leakey. There's essentially too many there in a way. But then primatologists are also arguing, and you've sort of mentioned this earlier, that it's very difficult for a human to train an orangutan how to behave in the wild. And essentially, her work comes under criticism for the way that she is essentially sort of slightly distorting these orangutans and also possibly introducing diseases into the rainforest.
Can I make a point about this? Because I think this is, I mean, I am not a primatologist, nor am I a scientist, nor have I visited her in her element in Camp Leakey.
But you did go to Camp Leakey,
I actually
did you?
did go to Camp Leakey. I actually did. I wasn't going to mention that. We went on a family holiday there when I was quite young, and I remember looking at the orangutans. And we actually adopted an orangutan. When I say adopted, you pay a monthly stipend to the orangutan. We're probably still paying it. Dad's probably still paying it. Yeah, I wanted to say that I find this quite unfair, right? Because when she arrives in the 1970s, the forest is under siege from loggers, and orangutans are largely kept as pets, and they're incredibly badly treated. And I think there is a sense in which she has to rehabilitate, she has to have them within an enclosed environment to keep them from poachers and loggers. And she has to kind of use these rehabilitation methods in order to accustom them to the wild. And I think there is a sense in which she is successful in that. And she's always up against political pressure from both the government and also from these money-making loggers. So I think that I can't speak for her scientific methods, but I do think that she, out of all of the 3 apes, she was given a really, really hard task because orangutans are so under threat. The bit of forest in which they can live dwindles by the day, as it was dwindling by the day in the 90s. And of course, in 1998, things get even more difficult when the New Order regime collapses, right?
Yeah, so in 1998, the Suharto regime collapses for a variety of reasons to do with the economic crisis in East Asia. And what essentially happens, as we mentioned, this was a very brutal, very repressive regime, particularly in its infancy. It was authoritarian, and it was it was not perfect when it comes to logging, as we've already mentioned. But what it did do is provide a sense of stability and authority and control over those logging operations. And what happens after the collapse of the Suharto regime in 1998 is it turns into what's called the Wild West. I mean, so now there is essentially no authority in charge and controlling logging operations. And so illegal logging and gold mining really booms throughout Borneo. And Galdikas finds herself in this incredibly difficult position of having to navigate quite a lawless environment involving cartels and illegal loggers. And this leads to a real upsurge in deforestation throughout Borneo. I think what's really devastating about this is by the 1990s, Galdikas, I think even she would admit that she is no longer really a serious academic researcher. I mean, academics have said that she did most of her research in the 1970s and has really pivoted into relentlessly focusing on conservation.
And it was kind of done in vain because by, the early 2000s, the population of orangutans in Borneo had dwindled by 70-80%. And you say that she, pivoted to conservation. Well, conservation was a losing battle because she was up against forces over which she had no control, however much she campaigned. And I think that's the great sadness of this story in a way is how much impact did she make? I mean, today there are about 60,000 orangutans. In 1973, when she arrived in Borneo, there were about 288,000. That is an 80% decline. Could she say that she had achieved what she set out to achieve? No, but there was little she could do. But on the other hand, she did put orangutans on the map. We understand the habits and behaviors of orangutans. And in large part, that is what drives conservation projects now, is that we understand that these are not animals fueled by basic instincts such as mating and food. These are emotionally complex primates with their own friendships and rivalries. They grieve, they love, they protect their young for 8 years. Understanding the emotional complexity of these animals helps the conservation, though now the conservation is almost impossible to achieve.
Yeah, I think what really struck me reading about her life was it really raises this question of the role of the individual in history. This is a great debate amongst historians. What role do individuals have versus the wider structures and contexts in which they operate in? And Galdikas is such a strong character, but what I certainly feel is by the end of her life, she seems to be being overwhelmed by these broader structures.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned that this is a tale about what an individual in history can achieve. If we compare her to any figure from history who was trying to achieve something in inhospitable circumstances, climate change dwarfs all of these, right? There's a sense now in which, and I think this is why it's such a relevant and timeless story, and one in which we can draw many lessons today, is that climate change is so all-encompassing that however heroic one's motivations are, and hers were in a sense, I mean, she completely dedicated her life to orangutans. However complicated her rehabilitation methods, she tirelessly fought in their corner, but there was a sense that she could never win the battle that she set out to fight.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Last Rites. Join us next week where we will be exploring another fascinating life.